Hello everybody. This is part of the module on building high-performing teams and managing others. Specifically in this video, we'll be talking about the Myers-Briggs personality test and implications for you in terms of managing yourself in the workforce and managing others, as well as building high-performing teams. To start, the Myers-Briggs is pervasively used in organizational life. I've been part of a team that was in corporate America where we all took the Myers-Briggs and our manager used it to help us function better as a team. And I've known many others who've had that same experience. That and the Strengths Finder, which I also asked you to take, are very popularly used tools. Even though the Myers-Briggs is not without its critiques, namely that somebody might take it and then it might change a bit over time and thus be a limitation. I have found that it's really reliable. I've administered this probably to, about 2,500 students and have thought about this for myself and others in my life and think it's actually really predictive and telling about people's personalities. So I'm a big fan, as are a lot of my management colleagues. So the Myers-Briggs is one sign of, we'll say, diversity. It involves 8 preferences, and specifically introversion, extroversion, intuitive sensor, thinker, feeler, and judger, perceiver. And you would also notice that in addition to your actual preference, which is 4 of those 8, because you would have a preference, introversion over extroversion, for example, you would have a percentage. And that percentage is associated with the strength of your preference. Now, to be sure, you may not act in accordance to your preference. And to give you an example, a colleague of mine, Andrew Hoffman, who is probably still now at the University of Michigan and was one of my colleagues at Boston University, he and I went abroad to Japan one summer together to help teach in the international management program. And we were out and about with a group of students, and he had gone out virtually every night. And we were talking about the Myers-Briggs, and he said, I said, well, clearly you must be an extrovert. And he said, no, actually I'm a moderate introvert. But I decided that because I'm an academic, that I would have to act like an extrovert sometimes in contradiction to my actual preference for introversion, which would cause me not to want to be going out at night after spending all day in the classroom with many students. So keep in mind, there is a choice in this, and there will be strengths to your personality type and as well as weaknesses that can correspond to that. Now, in terms of managing others and thinking about how to build high-performing teams, there are many other types of diversity that you'll need to understand and appreciate. So national culture differences, racial differences, gender diversity, sexual orientation, personality, work styles. In this class, we'll mostly focus on cross-cultural differences, national culture differences, personality, and functional differences as you build your teams. Functional meaning you all come from different backgrounds, some say in marketing, some in manufacturing, some in human resources, and you'll have to harness that diversity effectively if you're going to be on a high-performing team. But it also means you have to have a better understanding of what diversity is out there and the sticking points for where it can cause conflict as well as opportunities for leveraging it. So let me dig into 6 of the 8 preferences in this video, and you're going to be talking about judging and perceiving in the classroom. So I'm going to be talking about extroversion, introversion, intuitive sensor, and thinking, feeling to get you to think about yourselves. Now, there are 2 primary differences between extroverts and introverts, and in fact, there's actually emerged a 3rd category of people called an ambivert or ambiverts, and those are people who are, quote, slight in either direction. So you could fall as, say, a 12% extrovert, and that would really measure you as an ambivert. And it turns out that according to studies, about 2/3 of all people are actually ambiverts. They're slight in one direction. So they don't have extreme characteristics like moderate and extreme extroverts and introverts. Nonetheless, you have to understand all of them. So extroverts, well, let me take a step back. The 2 primary differences involve, number 1, where you get your energy, and number 2, how your brain functions. So it turns out that extroverts gain energy from being in social situations and with other people, whereas introverts gain energy, that is, they recharge their batteries by being alone or with a very small group of people, like one-on-one. In terms of the brain differences, it turns out when an extrovert is presented with a stimulus, the talking part of his or her brain, quote, lights up or reacts before the thinking part. So that's why you can hear an extrovert say, I only know what I think when I hear what I say. Versus introverts, when presented with the same stimulus, the thinking part of the brain, quote, lights up and starts to respond slightly before the speaking part. And that's why you will notice with some people that if you ask a question, you get a pregnant pause. Now, let me give you, I'll say in myself, I'm a moderate extrovert, and sometimes I can feel myself when somebody's talking. I really have to try at the very tail end when they're coming to a close to not jump right in. And then I will immediately say something, and I will sort of think through what I'm thinking as I'm talking and say 10, 15 seconds later, then I'll say, yeah, that's what I meant. Whereas an introvert, you could ask them the same question or get a pregnant pause. They think, you get silence, and then you get a much more honed response. Now, what's interesting about that, well, multiple things, one of which is that introverts actually have an asset over extroverts because they could be less likely accused of saying something foolish or less coherent. So, because whatever comes out of their mouth is usually exactly what they mean right when they say it. There are also drawbacks for introverts in the workplace. So let me introduce extroverts. They think best when they're talking with people. So, for example, I had an extroverted mentor at Boston University, and he would just say, come on over to my office and we'll talk about this, because he liked to brainstorm. Whereas my introverted mentor would say, can you email me ahead of time or at least set up an appointment so that I can think about our meeting before we actually get together? Extroverts prefer to act, then maybe reflect. They tend to be easy to get to know. They may seem shallow to introverts. And introverts, on the other hand, think best when they're alone, and they share their ideas when they're clear. They reflect, then act. They tend to be harder, we'll say, to get to know than extroverts. And they could seem withdrawn to extroverts. So, sometimes I think back to a few people in high school who had been pegged as, say, snobbish, for example, when the reality is they were probably just introverts. Now, there are all sorts of challenges that can occur between introverts and extroverts, which I will get to. But when you think about the implications of this, there could be many. Let me see, I think I have one more. I'll go back. In terms of how people respond when they're working together, and I'll talk more about this later, introverts can get drowned out of conversations because extroverts can often actually unwittingly dominate because their tendency is to talk and then think through things. So extroverts dominate the conversation, and the introverts think, boy, if I could only get in. Now, introversion and extroversion has been traced back by way of some studies to even babyhood, where there was a study done in which babies were stimulated, and so they would say get a light on them, something to present some stimulus in the environment. And what they found was that there were low reactant and high reactant babies. And those who were, quote, low reactants, that means when they were presented with a stimulus, they didn't really react very much, went on to become extroverts. Whereas introverts were the high reactant babies. So it didn't take very much to stimulate them. So that's why very often introverts would get, quote, like their brain would get, for lack of a better term, heated up or over-circuited more easily because they're more easily stimulated. So that's why when they have had a long day or even just a tough day midday, they really need to, say, shut the door, take time to level their energy, and they're going to do that by being by themselves. Whereas extroverts, they tend to really like the stimulation and really be more addictive to the social interactions. And people tend to try to level their energy all day, be at one level pace. So you could see introverts, maybe they get overheated, so to speak, they go back to be by themselves, they level out, and then they come back out and they can be interactive again. Whereas extroverts, would say be by themselves, and then they would have to get out and about and interact with people to then boost their energy level to where they need back to be. As an extrovert, even though I'm not extreme, I'm close to extreme, but I'm not extreme. I could spend a long day at the office interacting with a lot of people, and I'm often inclined to actually pick up the phone to call a friend on the West Coast on my way home from work. Whereas an introvert is much less likely to do that unless he or she's been alone a lot of the day. Now, a lot of people think, well, clearly extroverts have an advantage in the workplace, and they can, but research actually suggests that introverts have advantages too. So we'll leave that for you to talk about when you get into class. What are the advantages for extroverts? What are the advantages for introverts? Let me say this, that introversion and extroversion varies based on national culture. So, for example, there's a higher percentage of introverts in the American population vis-a-vis Britain. There are more introverts by way of comparison than there are extroverts. Similarly, in comparison to the United States, Asia has many more introverts, percentage of the population. Now, by the way, one thing to get you to think more about who has the advantages, if you think about people at the top, so some might say, well, clearly to be a CEO or the president, you're probably more likely to be an extrovert. If we just look ahead here at the top, well, it turns out that you can just be just as likely to be an introvert as an extrovert and be the CEO of a company or the president of a country. So if you look historically, you think, and we don't know this for sure, but Clinton would be somebody who'd be considered as a clear extrovert, whereas Obama has been discussed as an introvert. And if you remember, he was marred in the press because he would go home at night rather than to go out and schmooze. And part of the rationale he gave was, I have a family, I have 2 young girls. However, one might argue that at the end of the day, if he was indeed an introvert, that he may want to have gone home and just decompressed with a few people, that is his family. But to be sure, there are a lot of points of conflict around this. I can tell you with one of my undergrads once, a student had a eureka moment where he said, my goodness, I have been thinking this whole time that my roommate's a dud, because I would ask him to go out and do things after we come home from classes all day. And he would say, there's my mother-in-law's dog jumping off the bed. And he said, actually, now come to think of it, I think that he's just an introvert. So I've given this guy some grief when I didn't need to. More to be discussed in class. Okay, characteristics of a sensor and an intuitive. The sensor intuitive really is around how we process information. Now, when you think about sensors, the word sensor, sensory, people tend to process information through what they observe and can experience through the senses. So they're very literal. What can I see, smell, hear, touch, taste? Whereas intuitives tend to process information much more unconsciously and in the abstraction. And they will make associations with ideas, objects, through connection with another idea or object. So to give you an example, I used to give an exercise where I would give everybody a baseball. And I would say, tell me everything that comes to your mind as you describe the baseball. Now, it would not surprise you that very often the sensors would have shorter lists. They would be done more quickly than intuitives, because what would happen is the sensor would look at the ball, particularly if he or she was a moderate or extreme sensor where the preference is stronger. So you're really talking about 40 to 100 is that stronger preference. Maybe even a little more like 35 to 100. So those folks would look at the ball and they'd see the red laces, they'd see it's hard, it could hurt somebody if hit, they would bounce it up and down. The balls I gave them red made in China. And so they would get very literal and just experience the ball, and that was it. So they might have, 5 to 10 descriptors. Whereas the intuitives might, and very often they didn't, start with a description of the ball, and then they would make these huge lists of tangential ideas like, baseball gum, or some baseball player they were aware of, some joke that they thought it was boring, Some would describe having played baseball growing up. They describe bats, the dugout, and they would just go into tangents. And so the idea being there are very clear differences in how people process information and consequently how they interact with that information in their lives. So sensing types are very practical and realistic. They like to know the facts, the data, so that they can have a realistic depiction of a scenario. They like facts, detail, specifics. They like concrete communication. They focus on the specific parts or pieces. And they can seem too detail-oriented and literal-minded to the intuitives. Intuitive types are much more big picture, theoretical, imaginative. They like patterns, a meaning, big picture. They don't mind actually communications that's more figurative and abstract. And they can seem too fickle or impractical. One way that you could see this play out pretty easily is in brainstorming sessions, because the intuitives are the ones that have the most wild ideas, and then the sensors sit there and think, ugh, we'll never be able to do that. I don't know why you're going there. Whereas the sensors might be a little bit less wild, but much more concrete and pragmatic in their approach. Now, just to give you an example of me, I am a fairly extreme intuitive, and so I really do like thinking big picture. I can read an article or a book and get ideas to hang together very well. And a 300-page book, I don't really love details all that much. And so to give you an example of where this would be a downfall for me, when I was a doctoral student at Boston University, I remember that we had our comp exams in my third year, and so that meant part of that was we had 5 days to answer 7 essay prompts, and we ended up writing about 50 pages worth of writing coupled with bibliographies that were about 20 pages. And I finished mine the morning of the 5th day, and I thought, I'm done here. My work is done. And what I didn't do was check the bibliography or look at and read them through very closely. So lo and behold, weeks later, I get back my comp exams, and I did get very good results overall. However, one of the senior professors wrote that there were a number of word omissions and bibliographic omissions, and he had expected more of somebody of my ilk in creating that kind of detail. So he might have been a sensing type, but there was also something very real about his feedback to me, which was, as an intuitive, my inclination was not to do the bibliography, but I should have. It undermined the overall feel and look of my comp exams. Okay, thinking, feeling, how people make decisions. I sometimes give the idea that you're driving at night or close to night, you're driving at dusk, you're going around a windy road, pardon me, and a deer, in classic deer fashion, has a deer in headlights moment and lands in the middle of the street, and you hit it with your car. It flies up on your car and flops off, and it is actually lying in the middle of the road. So you pull your car over, and what goes through your mind? And I just pose it for people. And they say, and we don't know in the room who's a thinker or feeler. And what you hear from the thinkers are comments like, boy, I got to call my insurance. I think I got to move the car. I think maybe I have to flag down somebody or a police officer in order to move the deer or make sure that somebody else doesn't accidentally hit the deer or swerve off the road and, go into a ditch. And the feeler's responses are more like mine, which is, I feel devastated. I hurt this living animal. And I pose this in part because I've just known others have mentioned this as one way of thinking this through this dimension preference, but because I did hit a deer in California once, and my initial response was to get very weepy and upset. But my deer did prance off, and I say prance, probably more like hobbled off into the wilderness, and I like to believe that he or she is with Bambi somewhere. But it was very upsetting to me. I didn't care about the car. I wasn't Thinking of insurance, I just felt horrible that I had hit a living creature. Now, here is the way this plays out. Thinkers are very rational, they're analytical in making decisions, and they jump to logic in times of crisis. They don't mind hearing examples of negative feedback because it's going to help them get better, and they make decisions more impersonally. On the flip side, feelers are worried about how everybody copes when they make decisions. They're very good at making decisions that are in congruence with the emotional health of a team. They help solve conflicts, and they encourage others to make sure that the group is harmonious. And this is how they go about thinking about how to make decisions. They may not want to give or, frankly, even receive the negative feedback because it could hurt them or the other person. And a lot of their decisions focus on underlying values or deeply held principles that they have. Now, the thinkers, as you might imagine, can be accused by feelers of being way too impersonal, too logical. They don't care about people and the influence that their decisions have on other people. And the feelers can be confused as or considered to be too soft, too emotional, not logical enough. And so you might think, the next time you're interacting with somebody, try and think about how they respond when they're making a decision, and you may see how this plays out. Okay, so implications for managing oneself and building teams. Clearly, there are a couple of different things. I'll back off of that. So number one, your personality type, and I hope that you do a lot of research on this and even have people you love take this test because it can be very telling, is that there are implications for how you manage yourself. For example, there's a lot of information out there to suggest that you should consider choosing a career that resonates with your personality type. And many, many sites out there on the Myers-Briggs can, I think, actually be very helpful. The number one personality type career choice for somebody with my personality type is a teacher. So I think, okay, cool, I'm in the right job. It also means that you have strengths and weaknesses associated with your personality type, and you have to be able to manage those. Clearly, it means that you're going to have some strengths, but you also might have some limitations that you have to address. And in building teams, you have to realize that there are many points of friction between people of different personality types, and there are also leverage points, and you could talk about those when you are in the classroom. So to give you a few examples, I'm an ENFJ, and this means a lot of different things for me. So some strengths, I find it easy to be in a room with a lot of people, whereas extroverts tend to have larger social networks, but they don't have quite as deep a set of relationships. And so, for example, it might be that person's got a lot of acquaintances, but over time, they don't necessarily keep in touch with a lot of them. Whereas introverts tend to have smaller social networks, but they also have deeper relationships over time. So an introvert very often will tell you, I have few friends, but they're friends for life. And introverts are much more likely to get overwhelmed in terms of stimuli by being in a group of big people, whereas extroverts don't mind working a room. I like big picture thinking. So for example, if somebody told me, hey, you get to be part of a brainstorming session, that would be very fun for me. And as a feeler, I can usually understand people's and groups' moods. I can generally pick out from a classic, if you think about emotional intelligence, the classic way of viewing that is whether you can read people's emotions when you see them, like micro expressions, recognize them and act upon them. And I can generally do that. Now, some weaknesses, as I said, I don't like some details. That is hard for me. I work to get those details right as a professor, but there are ways that I don't manage those details as well as I'd like to. So I don't love doing bibliographies. I still don't like doing them. So a colleague who's a censor or who's just willing to put him or herself out there to do the bibliography is going to be my friend. I can accidentally interrupt people because, again, extroverts, because a stimulus is presented and the tendency is to talk before thinking, I can do that occasionally. I don't mean to do it, but it happens. And I can just put my foot in my mouth. Not in a bad way, like a mean way, but in a So occasionally I'll say something and think, ugh, I should have just slowed that thought down. And here's what I really mean 30 seconds later. Now, here's some implications of the extrovert introvert for teams. Introverts will enjoy seeing data, ideas, or agendas on paper before a meeting, which allows them time to digest this material. My main mentor at Boston University was very much this way, whereas extroverts can come to a meeting to flesh out the ideas through brainstorming, just different ways of approaching things. Now, introverts assume that if you don't ask, you don't want to know. And very often, introverts get drowned out in team conversations and people think, oh, well, you don't have anything to say, but they really do. And extroverts assume that if you don't speak up, you don't have an opinion. Extroverts often unwittingly dominate a discussion. And to be fair, power in meetings is often exerted by taking up space. You've exerted power if you choose to direct a conversation versus remain silent. So extroverts can unwittingly exert power when they may not need to or probably shouldn't. Now, here's one thing to keep in mind in the way of teams. Willingness to support a decision is highly correlated with the degree to which an individual's voice is heard. So if introverts, and this is more extreme ones, right? If you're a slight one, you're not going to have as much of a hard time getting your voice in during meetings. But if you are more of a moderate or an extreme extrovert, you may pause while other people say things, and then you don't get your voice heard, which is one reason why introverts are really it's important that they have the information ahead of meetings so that they can think about it, because they're much less likely to come get drowned out. Whereas in a brainstorming session, truly, introverts, because they're thinking through ideas on the fly and extroverts are dominating, the conversation may well get shut out. So one implication for a manager of a team is to realize that if people are quiet, they may well be the introverts, and their voices need to be logged on, or else you can find that you don't have the support at the end of the day that you need to. Okay, let me just give you an example in the workforce of a guy named Thomas Green and his boss, John, and we'll flesh this out a little bit more in the class. Thomas they work for a marketing firm. Thomas initially was a sales guy, and he did extremely well, so much so that he convinced a vice president that he should be a senior marketing analyst, So he went from being a sales guy and bypassed a junior marketing analyst role to become a senior marketing analyst. Okay. Now, one thing to realize is that a sales job is much different than a marketing analyst job. The latter requires a lot of understanding of data, how to analyze that data, how to create plans based on data, and projections of that data and analysis of that data, whereas sales could be much more about wooing clients. Now, his boss, John, is a VP of marketing, and it turns out he's a sensor. Thomas is an intuitive. So what happened was, when Thomas was a sales guy, the data, the details weren't as important to the success of that job. Whereas as a senior marketing analyst, the data and an ability to analyze them were critical. So Thomas, it turns out, would be very good at wooing his clients and talking to them ultimately about how this marketing firm was going to take care of them and what they would do in the way of helping build their clients' respective markets. But then when it came time to come up with these really delicately created and thoroughly created marketing analyses, Thomas would come up short. And John, his boss, would say, hey, where are all these detailed marketing plans? And Thomas would say, you know what, it's all up in my mind. It's all here, and don't you worry. These clients, they don't care as much about the data as much as the end game, which is where they're going to go, and I will give them a very clear indicator at the end of this. So it became, unfortunately, a point of friction between them because John really wanted Thomas to provide these detailed marketing analyses to clients, and Thomas wasn't really willing to give them. And it ended up leading to a lot of conflict and ultimately both Thomas Green's and his boss John's demise. And you could talk a little bit more about that in the class next week. Now I will move on to a different video.